Hey everybody, I am Benjamin Lancaster, the writer and director of The Further Adventures of Walt's Frozen Head, and you're listening to the director's commentary. So we started with this quote from Pinocchio, and the takeaway out of this one, I think, is the phrase, "No request is too extreme." So this was going to be a movie about holding on to things for too long, and in some ways, I think it's the antithesis of the traditional Disney message. The Disney message is personified in that song that they sing, and that's when you wish upon a star, your dreams come true. And I wanted this film to kind of be an exploration about when you're holding on to your dreams a little too much. And so we really called out that phrase, "No request is too extreme." Really? No request? Because I can think of some pretty extreme requests. But before I get too much into that, let me comment on some of these night shots. A lot of people were asking how we got them. The answer is you stick around really late. The park does start to clear out, and you get some pretty good shots of a pretty abandoned Magic Kingdom, especially if you go on a day that's not too crowded. So as you can see, we're going further and further into the utilidors here. We'll get into a little bit about the filming of that later, but I'm a big believer that you put the thing that's the hardest to swallow right up front in your movie. You deliver on the promise of the title, and you tell people what the movie's going to be about. And so pretty much right off the bat, we're telling people this is a movie about the further adventures of Walt's Frozen Head. It's in the title. And now we're going to meet Walt. We're not holding that back. We're not keeping it a secret. The reveal is right there, 2 minutes into the film. So very early on, I knew I wanted this change in aspect ratio. Films that are bigger, more epic, more grand tend to have this wide aspect ratio. And I wanted to film in an aspect ratio that was even narrower than 16:9, which is your normal TV aspect ratio. So if you notice black bars on the side, those are intentional. And those are there because this is the aspect ratio that a lot of the Disney comedies of the 1960s were filmed in. It's a little bit narrower than we're used to, and I think that tells the audience subtly that this is a smaller story. This is a story. This is a story about smaller stakes. This is a story about a small family incident, and that it's not this sort of grand story. And so really pulling that to the forefront by changing the aspect ratio at the very beginning of the movie was part of that plan.
If that's okay. Okay.
So here we have some shots in the Magic Kingdom. These were obviously, although that top one was obviously gotten from the top of the train station. We'll talk a little bit more about the process of filming in the Magic Kingdom once we get into the kind of break-in scene later in the movie. But suffice it to say, we did film in there.
Pete.
So Pete's name is actually one of the regrets I have about this movie. Looking back on it, I really wish I would have called him Chris. He was named Pete because we could get that name tag, but there were tons of Chris name tags. That wasn't an issue. Chris is the generic name that they use on Walt Disney World cast members' name tags. If you forget your name tag or you just want to swap it out for some reason, you can always grab a Chris from Orlando. Boy or girl, works for either. So it's the kind of generic name tag. So I wish we had called him that. I wish he had actually been a Chris from Orlando. But, it is what it is. So we are meeting Peter in this scene. Several people said they had to actually check to see if there wasn't all of these Mickeys. Obviously, there have been lots of Mickeys. I think there have been a few of them. Unfortunately, there has not been a Michael Eisner Mickey, as far as I am aware, because otherwise I would own that one.
We have recreations of the dolls that we sold in the 30s that don't even look like the character did back then. We have had Mickey.
Some of the 30s Mickeys are really creepy if you've ever seen them.
A sailor, a longshoreman.
So this scene was shot in the kitchen of the UCF sound stages. I was being shown around the sound stages and found this location, and the pipe in the background just sold it for me. I was like, no, I'm going to film here. I'm going to film here. I just liked the fake plant sitting in front of the pipe. Like, it's this industrialized area that's trying to be repurposed into something a little more homey. And for some reason that just worked for me for this, like, office in the utilidors. Like, it's this highly industrialized area, and they're trying to do something, so like throw a fake plant up. And I just thought that was funny, and just worked very well for the vibe we were going for. So I'm glad that pipe features so prominently.
How long ago did you buy it, Pete?
About 8 years ago, maybe.
Oh, perfect. I'll just put 8 maybe into the computer.
You can do that.
So here I'm trying to establish Peter's motivation in getting the doll by giving him this kind of MacGuffin, this thing that he's after in the very beginning that we then can tie into later. I'm hoping that is building the foundation for the theme, and that we're going to explore as the movie goes on, which is obviously about giving stuff up and showing that he is trying to rekindle this childhood in his own kid. And it's just ultimately a losing battle, and everyone kind of questions him on it, but, you know, he's determined that he's going to do what he's going to do.
Who are you going to believe, me or the computer?
So part of the production design challenge for some of this was actually, you know, we knew that we were going to be recreating some Disney paraphernalia, but in Orlando especially, the Kinko's is particularly nervous about printing anything with the Disney logo. So, for example, those invoices there don't have the Disney logo on them because Kinko's made us take them off. I think some of them do, and that was the ones we could print on the home printers, but the colored paper didn't, or I forget exactly the exact formulation of that. This scene was filmed at the UCF chilled water plant, which was just this fantastic industrial location, which kind of opens up the utilidors into something a little more industrial. We got permission to film in there overnight one night, obviously with a level of supervision, and it's just this beautiful scene. The downside was it was really noisy in there, so all the scenes in there had to be ADR'd, as did the scene in this location. This is a bowling alley. It's Boardwalk Bowl on Colonial in Orlando. If you can see, some of the machines are actually still running currently. It was supposed to be empty when we filmed. It turned out that league bowling was going on, which is sort of the opposite of empty. But we were very glad to have the location. And sometimes you just got to roll with the punches. But, you know, this corridor of kind of endless rows of machinery was just really what we were looking for descending into this industrial world where Walt lives. I got to call out some of the screen work that our visual effects supervisor did. I think that just adds a ton. He really just went through the movie and added stuff onto all the screens that he could. You know, some like this one is obviously called out, but look at the one over Peter's shoulder. It's this screensaver, which I think brings the world alive.
Hey, Bill, you scared the crap out of me. What are you doing down here?
I'm sorry, but you saying
What
something?
are you doing down here?
I don't know, finishing up the wired security panel down here. But what are you doing here?
So we introduced these security panels, and originally they were going to have more of a plot point.
For my daughter.
The original version of the script kind of went off in a different direction, and which I'll probably talk about once we get further into it. But ultimately, we refocused the script on what I think are kind of the family relationships and the emotion. And so the technology and the things all kind of got pushed aside, except for the emotional motivation that they kept, which was specifically that Walt hasn't seen the park in 3 dimensions. He hasn't seen it for real. He's only seen it on these computer monitors.
Bit of humor there. Anyway, You're on the second
So
floor.
if you'll notice,
There's another
one of
floor.
the design elements we did to kind of tie all the 3 levels of the utilidors together, even though they were filmed in very different places, was that they all have stripes on the walls corresponding to the places they're supposed to be under.
Where do I go?
Though it's a real thing that they do in the utilidors at the Magic Kingdom. But in the utilidors in the Magic Kingdom, there's only 1 level. In our utilidors, there's 3. So you can go down further. So if you'll notice, there's a blue stripe indicating that like you're on the 2nd level under the blue section, which is Tomorrowland. Other places have a solid 1 green stripe, and then our lowest level has, which you'll see it in just a minute, has 3 red stripes wherever you are. So you can kind of tell exactly where you are by the stripes on the walls. And that's a motif that's really exists in the utilidors that we carried throughout the production design here. This scene was filmed at Orlando Brewing, who were very gracious to let us use the facility for 3 days.
The second quarter that I specifically wanted you to take a look at, the VOD platform.
So we really were trying to go for a retro look to a lot of the technology that's running the cryogenic lab, as if, this was technology that was created in the 1960s, that was sort of revamped at one point in the 80s, and they've kind of been shoestringing it since then. So we were able to get a lot of older equipment for that. You can tell those like touchscreen monitors from the 90s. Those were actually came from UCF and were used as touchscreen monitors in various places, probably in the early 2000s, so maybe a little earlier than we were looking at. And then those iMacs that are pretty old, but have those classic old school decals on them from the Walt Disney World resort.
You should see the metrics on this thing. Why, we designed it with you in mind, Walt, and I promise it's just as
So a
good as
lot
it
of the interface here was sort of inspired by Roller Coaster Tycoon. We liked the idea that the thing that these executives want, they're so sort of business minded that the thing they want is to be able to track individual people walking around the resort and get this sort of psychographic profile of each of the guests. I also think that's probably fairly realistic to the expectations when FastPass was first rolling out. You got to remember we were shooting this thing back in 2015. FastPass was a lot newer back then, and we've seen the sort of expansion on it as it's gone. But back then they were talking a lot about purchase tracking and knowing when you walked into a gift shop and things like that. And I think a lot of that was probably implemented without us knowing it, but that's part of what's going on in this technology. It's sort of a fanciful version of the FastPass program.
At least leave me somewhere to turn the pages.
Hey, I thought you were leaving for that hotel consulting job with Dave and Carlos.
The behind-the-scenes shots of the first level of the utilidors here were filmed at Fashion Square Mall, and that's also in Orlando. I mean, the whole film was shot in Orlando, so they were very gracious to give us access to their backstage utilidors, which look remarkably like the actual backstage utilidors. So we were very glad to have them. So we wanted this elevator to look a little more ominous than it probably turned out, but there were just some lighting controls we couldn't quite adjust for. Unfortunately, we couldn't turn the lights out in the elevator to give it more of an ominous look. But, I think it still works. It's a pretty creaky looking elevator as is. And that voice right there, that is YouTube's Tim Tracker, who's a YouTube celebrity. At least within the Disney community. So this location we got, it was adjacent to the chilled water plant that I talked about earlier, and this was a location that we got because it was a power plant on UCF campus that was shut down for the first time in I think its 25-year lifespan, and we were just absolutely thrilled. I mean, look at this location. We couldn't have come up with a better location had we just designed one in a lab. I mean, we only got access to it because for the first time in its lifespan, it had broken down, and they were waiting for a part to come in from Japan, and so we were allowed to shoot in here. And so we instantly We found out the afternoon before we were supposed to shoot that evening. So we instantly rewrote our shot schedule to accommodate the new location because it was just too good to give up. So there's this subtle cue whenever Peter's about to go off on an adventure, or Peter or Walt, I should say. Whenever they're kind of in an industrial setting and I can justify putting it in, there's this subtle cue of kind of trains in the background. That links with obviously Walt's love of trains and the trains that play the plot point later in the film, but I think it gives it this sense of momentum, the sense of moving forward. So that was a neat little, sound design element that I think uses sound design to add to the dramatic tension. So that wall back there is fake. I would have actually liked to have a door back there, but we had to construct that. And so we had to have the entrance to the cryogenics room off screen. We got Orlando Brewing fairly last minute. We were going to be shooting on the sound stage until this came through, and it was not going to look nearly as good. Some people who know breweries really well say they can identify this immediately as a brewery, but I think most people just see it as sort of industrial with large vats and things. So I think it works pretty well as the cryogenics room. And if you see pictures of real cryogenics rooms, they actually look quite a bit like breweries. So we'll go with it. Obviously, all those liquid nitrogen signs are the and other warning labels and things like that are the product of our production designer and her team, Leah Augustine, who put all those together and really did a lot of set dressing for this.
You guys had me going there for a minute.
The kegs in the back probably give it away more than anything else. We did cover the Orlando Brewing labels, but they still kind of look like kegs.
It's really neat.
Guys?
So this was the scene that got the most rewrites in between the time we shot it with Peter and then the time we shot it with Walt. There was a lot of kind of re-editing and rejiggering and reworking to make sure that a lot of these moments landed right. Some based on his performance. He does a lot of kind of rambling in this that didn't always come out the same each take. And then some based on trying to make the scene a little more realistic for the revelation that Walt was real and alive and right in front of him. So there were some slight variations and changes that we made in between the first version, the version we shot with Peter, and then ultimately what we shot with Ron on the soundstage later.
You need me to do...
It was about a year between the time we shot all the stuff with Peter and then the Ron on the soundstage. So we had a really good idea of what the movie looked like at that point, which was very helpful. We could go in with Ron and get exactly what we needed. Obviously, Ron gave great performance and great feedback and wound up reworking some of his lines to bring them in line with what he saw as the vision of the character, which was all fantastic. But, it was really helpful having that film really in place so we knew exactly the shots we needed.
I work at Box Office Gifts with the Camera Center on Main Street.
Camera Center?
I also like that Peter's working for, a center that they were a camera center, now they sell magic bands. This kind of, he's feeling his obsolescence here, which I think is something that is a powerful force for people who sort of feel like their way of life, what they've been working at all this time, is kind of going away. So that was a little detail I liked adding.
You're ahead of the curve of innovation.
It's a cheap joke, but it gets a chuckle.
Give me one day in the Magic Kingdom. You'll be running every gift shop, pop stand, and souvenir cart in all of Disney World.
We had a long discussion as to what Walt should call soda. Would he call it soda or would he call it pop? I tried to do some research on this and find out, because he was from Missouri, but in 1901, born in Chicago, and ultimately I went with pop. I don't know. If anyone has an affirmative answer, I've heard real Walt quotes with him calling it Coke, but he might have just actually been referring to Coca-Cola, so I can't say one way or another. Maybe we should have said Coke stands, but we said pop stands.
Okay, well then, stealing your disembodied head, whatever you want to call it. Either way, you know what? I don't remember them telling me anything about this when I went through.
We were given a very strict warning when we shot on the UCF sound stages that we weren't to like move around any couches or any benches or any furniture or anything like that. So we
I used to know and approve everything.
we stole that trash can that Walt's head is sitting on. It's a really nice metal trash can. We put it back then later, so I think I can reveal it now. But at the time, that was probably against the rules. I doubt anyone who knows is actually going to listen to
I can
this.
still follow through on a promise, you know.
With all due respect,
So really, we'll see when we get the smoking. I'll point it out next time. The smoke came through it very nicely. There's no smoke in this shot, but we had a lot of fake smoke throughout this scene. So we had a smoke machine actually embedded into the stand, so it kind of wafted out. It looks really good in some of those shots. So I'll point out the next one so you can see what I'm talking about. So we knew Peter was going to have to say no and sort of be convinced into going on this adventure, partially to kind of reinforce his idea that he's not an adventurous person, he's not a rule breaker, doesn't take risks. But then we also wanted him to connect that with his daughter, so we tried to make it about his daughter and his need to provide for her. I'm not sure that point exactly landed, but that's sort of what we were going for.
We just move on with this.
All right, new VOD platform, page 1.
And Disney Plus is coming to... I'm sorry. We did predict the future with this. I will say, for all the times this movie is now out of date, that is one time we predicted the future.
No, I mean, you do actual work. As in
Just a little FYI here, we shot this wrong. At least that's what my visual effects guy says. We shot this without thinking that monitor was going to have to turn on. So we have her turning it off quite frequently. And that's purely for technical reasons. Her hair is not solid enough to do a monitor through realistically. So we do it very briefly there, and then she clicks it off. Sort of. I mean, that's what we're trying to convince people of. So that we don't have to animate around her hair continuously, because that was just going to be a mess.
out of my storeroom. Hey!
You can see that calendar on the wall. That's we have a lot of little details around if you have really sharp eagle eyes somewhere on the monitor, and you probably couldn't see them. But that calendar on the wall there has the opening date circled, which I liked that idea because I think they haven't changed the calendar. There it is. Haven't changed the calendar since the park opened. That's probably not true. I'm sure they've changed the calendar.
Happy birthday to you.
Dad, it's passing period. I have 3 minutes. And besides, I'm not
So
16 for
Kate
40.
came into this project in a kind of interesting way. Kate plays Molly, the 16-year-old daughter. She was a freshman in the film department, and she was in a class I was TAing. And I think there was extra credit involved, but regardless, we were looking for volunteers to help us with casting, to just kind of shuffle people in and out, and maybe do some reading against people and things like that. You know, just really helping with the audition, nothing more.
Besides, Jen
And
I
we
will-
heard more Mollies
Don't
in
worry,
our
that's okay.
casting than any other character by far.
The movies with Jan anytime.
More
opening
16-year-old girls wanted to be Molly than any other character we had.
Technically, movies open Thursday at midnight.
And at some point, the producer, Tyler, and I just looked at each other and said, you know who the best one we've heard so far? It's the girl reading against the Peters. Because she was doing the reading against the Peters for their auditions. And, you know, we just asked her, like, hey, yeah, we don't want to get your hopes up here. It's not a sure thing. Would you be interested in coming in for callbacks and reading? And she said, sure, absolutely. So she came in for callbacks. The girl nailed the audition, just absolutely blew everyone else out of the water. We thought she was doing well just doing the reading, and turns out she was holding back. So we were very thrilled to have her on board that way. And the moral of the story is help people with their auditions. You never know what'll happen.
Come on, Molly. It's only family.
Even better. What's the final bell? I've got to go.
I love you, all right?
So Peter's obviously sitting in the Magic Kingdom for this conversation. We do 2 phone calls back and forth to Magic Kingdom. It kind of helps pad out the park runtime. It's a little cheap. What are you gonna do? Okay, so some people mentioned this, I saw earlier, as that we used green screen for the park. And you're right, these shots of the guy and his daughter are green screen. I mean, there's a couple of reasons for that. One is... we were okay doing scenes in the park with adults. Doing a scene with a kid was going to be harder. Getting this family in and out with us when we were filming all this other stuff was going to be very difficult. Ultimately, it just wound up being a lot easier for us to do this on green screen. So we shot the plates while we shot the Peter stuff. And then, they didn't have much room. We actually filmed that outside so the lighting would match on a similar day. Obviously some people are still pointing it out. It is what it is. I wish we had been able to shoot it in there, but I'm ultimately glad we didn't take the risk.
That's why we think home media sales have leveled off for now. Tim, do you want to go over the sales projections for our retail outlets?
So some of this B-roll we got much later, B-roll being the kind of images of Splash Mountain and things. But once again, I'll get into more talking about shooting in the park once we get to kind of break-in scene towards the end of the movie. You'll have to wait around till then.
My head's spinning with all these...
So the one plot point I will cop to as being a little unrealistic is the time compression on this day. Ultimately, we just kind of had to make it all work. Because it set up the timeline for the rest of the movie, but I'm not particularly proud of it because the park closes ridiculously early. Molly's birthday party is very late. Then he goes over to somebody else's house. Then he goes back there and gets blackmailed by Mom. So, I mean, spoilers, but I assume you've seen the movie before by this point. But yeah, this seems to happen very early in the day for the amount of events that occur in the rest of the day. Oh, by the way, I had not seen The Good Dinosaur when we mentioned this. It was on a list of upcoming Disney films. So, it seems very dated at this point that he's watching The Good Dinosaur, but, it is what it is.
And not like low 6 figures.
I remember at the time the other option being the Day of the Dead film, which is now called Coco. Could have gone with that one.
There's a hitch in the back. You push it in.
This image was used a lot in our promotional publicity because I think it, not him falling off, but the image of them talking to each other, because I think it really captured the kind of relationship they were going to have. It worked well, so we wound up using it a lot in promotional stuff. So this was one of our many cheats of how to avoid showing his head just to keep our visual effects somewhat limited, even though this was a very visually effects-heavy film for a micro-budget comedy. That is Lake Eola. Some people are confused, like, why are they in the city? Why are we seeing a fountain? Guys, it's because, like, the city of Orlando, where the people live, has icons, and you're seeing one of those icons. So if next time you go to Orlando, you could go to actual Orlando.
So it'll be pretty easy for us to just blend in.
I used to wear dark glasses and a hat to walk around Disneyland.
Yeah, well, I don't think that's gonna cut it. Checking the forecast.
Touring Plans was in the script long before we got Len Testa to do a cameo. That was just an added bonus for us, but it's a service that I always use to plan my day, so I figured Peter might too.
You gotta hide.
Who's that?
It's my parents.
So those 2 pictures on the back of the wall, one of them's me and my brother at Epcot, and the other is a picture of Kate
Well, I have a house, I just don't live.
as a kid throwing a snowball.
Carol and I just...
I should explain that go.com joke, because a couple of people asked me about it. For those of you who don't know, Disney actually tried to make a play in the internet space to compete with, like, well, it wasn't Google at the time, but like the search engines at the time, like Yahoo. And go.com was their effort. Unfortunately, no one used go.com, but it's still there. It'll redirect you to the Disney site.
Please, call me Walt.
Call him
one of the things people commented on is these characters seem to be pretty popular. For whatever screen time they get, it's just magnified by the fact that they're nice characters and they have the benefit of having this very fun reaction to Walt's head in a jar. Everyone else kind of doesn't believe it or is a little freaked out, but they're like fully accepting of that this is a real reality, and we're happy with the we fully accept this. So I think that's a clever twist on people's reactions.
Thank you, Larry. We're very proud of it.
Peter, were you planning on...
And them kind of fan gushing over Walt instead of being confused by the fact that he's the head in a jar. That makes me chuckle.
I'm sure he's more than welcome.
You know what? I don't think that's such a good idea.
This was a very hard bedroom to film in. It wound up being a lot smaller than we kind of thought it was on the scouting trips. And we wound up not getting some shots we wanted because the dimensions of the bedroom just didn't allow us to get them. And or we would get them, but they didn't turn out right because the bedroom. And so we were already filming with very wide lenses, and it just forced us to get pretty creative in the way we shot some things. I'll point out the one we didn't get in a bit when we come across it. That happens a little later. I do like the framing on this, though. That kind of claustrophobicness of the house really works to sell the comedy of this. So you get what you take and get what you can. This was actually Daniel's house. The actor playing Peter, it's his bedroom and living room, and he was gracious enough to let us shoot it there. We were looking for something very kind of old Florida, to contrast with the very much more modern house that Caroline has.
Since 1928.
And so it was exactly the look we wanted. The dimensions just were a little difficult to film in. Okay, so here we are at Caroline's house. You can tell it's a very different style. We were not sponsored by Brisk, unfortunately. I wish we had been. It's got sweet tea money. We were sort of sponsored by Orlando Brewing. They let us film in their location, and we told them we'd drop a few bottles in the film and to help them out, and that's what we did.
That's not what you meant, and you know it. Where's your present?
Well, I was going to give it to her on Saturday.
I'll also point out a nice little production design element that our production designer added is everyone else's present, as you see when we'll pan to the table, really matches the decor, which is these purples and golds and then beige. And then his present is just pink and paisley and just very different than the rest of the surrounding decorations. So, which you'll see once we actually pan over there. I probably could have waited to mention that.
Just put it over there, Peter.
Whoa.
Yeah, you can see it there.
Well, what was I supposed to say to her? You stay here. Keep quiet.
So one of the things I think was important for this movie was that we don't have a bad guy in this. That was intentional. We originally it was a wackier plot with a security guard and then being chased around, blah, blah, blah. And ultimately it never quite coalesced because it was just this sort of silly sitcom plot. So instead of a silly sitcom plot, we went with an overly sentimental sitcom plot. I mean, there's some truth in that. This is very much this sort of little low-stakes family drama. And that's conscious, but I didn't want the horrible, jerky ex-wife. I wanted someone who's a little sympathetic. And I'll admit she's a little more high-strung here than she gets, but I hope I humanize her as the movie goes on. And I hope that, that's something that connects, that there aren't bad guys here. This is a tricky situation. It's a real and human situation about a guy giving up his vision of what his relationship with his daughter is going to be like. I mean, that's hard, but it's also, I think it's something that doesn't require anyone to be at fault.
She's 15. She's 15, and you're going to send her off to Europe.
Peter, it's a school trip. It's barely a month.
Here I think Peter kind of comes off as, I don't know if a jerk, though. I mean, everyone has their sort of rationale for doing what they're doing.
Yeah,
I don't want my
which
16-year-old
I think
daughter
was
traipsing around
important.
Europe for the summer.
This is not the time.
No, it's not.
I didn't want,
We
you know,
should
I
have
didn't
had
want
this
Peter to be a
conversation
man
months
of no
ago,
action,
but we didn't.
as he's kind of a
You think
sad
just
sack
because
in
I
the
moved out,
beginning,
it's
I'll
gonna
admit
cut
that,
me
but
out of her life?
here he's sort of
You
standing up,
can't.
but he's doing it in the wrong way.
You can't.
I think the music that we have here really helps. Our composer did a fantastic job with all of this, but I'll definitely call it out here.
Everyone, please.
It was hard to score. We went through a couple of different versions. I know, and kind of back and forth, and ultimately settled on this thing that's
I can't believe
sad, but a little quieter than we originally went with.
Molly.
To kind of underscore the tension that everybody else in the room is also feeling. And then we do sort of undercut it with a comedy scene that's coming up in just a bit.
That's not a real train. Where's the caboose? A train doesn't need a caboose. It just needs an engine. Haven't you ever seen a train like in the movies? Of course it needs a caboose. Nuh-uh. There's a train that goes by my school at recess every day, and it only has 4 cars, and they have coal or something in them. What does a caboose even do?
Our visual effects artist and I called these the Iron Man shots. In reality, there's no place for a camera to actually be, but you know, you kind of gotta find a way to show Walt's face, so you sort of make up this invisible shot and you give him some displays to make it seem like he's not completely sitting there in the dark.
Present. Who wrote the Declaration?
I think it works on an emotional level, if not a logical level.
Thomas Jefferson.
These scenes were filmed, we shot an Airbnb because we knew we couldn't inconvenience the homeowners, for any set of homeowners for as long as we did. Because they were shot so late into the night. We shot our kids first to try and get them out at a decent hour. But then the adults, we were just keeping till very late, because we knew the whole party scene had to happen at night. So we had consistent lighting. It would be easier than trying to shoot it over the day. It's a longer scene, requiring a lot of extras.
It's true.
So it was a place we rented for a couple nights, and
She says
yeah, with their permission, we did make sure the Airbnb people did know we were shooting a movie there. So that thankfully that was not a surprise to them.
I know.
Okay.
Everybody in Florida has a pool, by the way. At least most people. So it's not as much of an indication as it would be in other parts of the country.
I think it's a trick. Then ask us something. How old's Disney World?
Well, it opened in 1971, but construction...
What's my baby brother's name?
Listen, I mostly answer questions about trains.
That's kind of lame. Trains are lame.
Shut up, you punk kid.
You broke it. I didn't do it.
You can actually hear the kids say scatter there, so they're reading their instructions instead of just actually scattering. But
Wait, I'm sorry.
there was not too much to be done about that, and I'm not sure anyone else besides
Look, I gotta
me
go.
noticed.
Tell your mother that we'll talk later.
Dad, where are you going?
What did you do?
So, just a little background, those are actually not Florida crickets. I had moved to the
What's wrong?
state of Missouri by the time I was getting some sound effects, so those are crickets from my Missouri backyard. So, there's I'm sure someone will add that to the goofs on IMDb at some point, so that those are obviously Missouri crickets. If you've ever been at Florida at night outside, the crickets are incredibly loud, so it was definitely something we knew we wanted to have, but yeah. Once again, I don't know if you can even tell. I'm not a bug expert.
We really appreciate it.
So this scene's kind of an exposition dump. We knew we needed some sort of a ticking clock on Walt, and so it's kind of hand-waved away as the majority of science is in this movie, which I don't think is necessarily a bad thing. It's got all the scientific accuracy of the absent-minded professor. So it's like science reasons are the reason it's science reasons, of course. So in personally, I think in this kind of movie that works. It's not primer. It's not something along those lines. It's not hard sci-fi. It's really fantasy with kind of a sci-fi veneer.
The boys in the lab tried to explain it to me. They have to refreeze me every 72 hours.
Yeah, but here's the weak explanation.
About frost cycles and water vapor
and also trying to address the fact that he doesn't have a body and why. We make a few jokes, he doesn't have lungs and things like that, but I didn't feel like it was totally worth an explanation.
Well, you got more than enough juice to get you home. Charge it overnight. And one more thing.
This also got a chance to bring back a character for a little bit longer.
You good?
And solve their technical problem at the same time.
Good luck, Walt.
That scene, by the way, was the hottest. I will mention how hot some of the scenes we filmed were. That was the hottest. By far. It was a closed-off garage with no air conditioning in the middle of July on a summer's day. The other hot scene was the brewery that we saw earlier. That sweat. Anytime you see sweat in this movie, that is real sweat. And that is usually because the scene is baking. So this is the only scene in the house that was not I'm not sure. Peter's parents' house that is not actually in the house we saw on the outside there. It's a little weird that they have this very modern laundry room attached, but it was the laundry room we could film in.
Peter, you're not letting
So this is a real story. That Walt used to tell at parties and things, I assume.
That's the punchline.
I think Walt is giving advice that's not the best here, and part of that is he still has a lot of his journey to go on. And so he's giving advice that isn't necessarily as fully formed. It kind of relates to the situation, but it's not as fully formed as he'll be able to give later. Oh, so the voice of the TV artist here is has a YouTube channel called Big Fat Panda. He's a YouTube parks guy, and you should definitely check out his channel. But we asked him if he would record this, and I chose The Happiest Millionaire because if you've seen that movie, it actually relates to a lot of the same themes that we're looking at this movie. Also, the last movie Walt worked on before. Well, there's a lot of movies that make that claim. Oh, so this was a shot I was talking about earlier. We originally had a shot where he crossed the room and flopped down on the bed, and because of the dimensions, the shot just didn't work. So we got the shot, and then we pulled it into the editing room and went, eh. So sometimes that happens. We tried a million different ways to try and fix that shot, because it comes a little abruptly, it feels, but ultimately there just wasn't a solution we had without going back and trying to refilm something, and at that point, Daniel was living in a different house, so we couldn't.
No.
But Dad.
No.
I'm not sure all those no's were in that script. I think he was searching for his line there.
You didn't say we'd be going with Walt Disney.
Oh, no, but Daniel was an incredible trooper throughout this whole movie.
And we're not.
He came on the project. He was the first one we told and let into the secret about the film and what exactly we were going to be doing. Everyone auditioned for the project under a false name, a false synopsis and everything. But he just threw himself into this role. He's acting against a green screen for the majority of it and just gives a terrific performance, and also was just like, he would just volunteer to push around the equipment carts and things like that. Just exactly he should be focusing on his acting, and instead he's like trying to help out however he can. Just a fantastic person to work with and give a great performance. Oh, that was Len Testa right there, who runs Touring Plans and is on the Disney Dish podcast.
Okay, tell me one more time why we can't go to the Magic Kingdom.
So I assume you've seen the movie before if you're listening to the commentary. So this was, we're getting to the SeaWorld reveal, but this was actually shot right outside Universal Studios. It's not on the track, but we could hear the little Jurassic Park music because the Jurassic Park ride is literally right there. But we got a permit and permission to shoot there, so you know, we didn't get permits for everywhere, but we got one for there. That is a city-owned sidewalk that we're shooting on, but we needed something that looked like the outside of a theme park, and we found something that looked like the outside of the theme park because it was Universal Studios.
I blame the media.
You just don't get it at all, do you?
Okay. I'm taking you to the next best place.
And then we do our hard cut into the SeaWorld, which always gets a chuckle.
Oh, you've got to be kidding.
Come on.
Finding background music was actually a bit of a challenge, and the SeaWorld background music especially. SeaWorld has this very specific kind of sound. I think we got pretty close. This aquarium obviously is not SeaWorld as well. This is the Clearwater Aquarium.
It's all fake.
My wife likes to tell the story about the time I made her drive across town to get a bench, because I wanted a specific bench for this scene, and she drove to a couple places, and I was very specific about the bench I wanted. And if you go through this scene and count the number of times we actually see that bench, the number is 0.
Jungle Cruise, fake animals.
So, I'm sorry, honey.
The Matterhorn, fake castle.
Some of these shots were determined not by when they gave the best performance, but when the fish were swimming by, because we tried to get as many fish as possible into this movie.
Swimming in real water. Not.
That was obviously easier for some shots than others.
You built a fake little town for crying out loud.
We had a very limited time on this set, though. We had to really get in and out quickly. Luckily, the person giving the majority of the lines didn't have to be there. I laugh now, but it really speeds up filming when only one of your two actors can forget their lines.
Main Street. That made it real.
So this is not an original observation, but I really like it that the Magic Kingdom kind of functions as a biography for Walt in some ways, or I should say Disneyland. You have this idea that you're entering through his childhood, and you're being drawn in by these fantasy stories, and then you get distracted by this vision of the future and by these true life adventures. You know, so yeah, I think there really is something to that, whether consciously or subconsciously, that it really does mirror Walt's ideas, and that he wants to show you the quintessential American experience, which also happens to be his American experience.
Disney World.
So some of these lines are actually cribbed from quotes, either from Walt or from the critics of Walt. You know, people, the cornfield in Burbank was something they did call the Disney Company for a while. Not because it was a cornfield, but because it produced corn, you know, corny films, essentially. You know, so I tried to do as much research as I could in getting into the character of Walt in this film. I read probably 5 biographies. The main one I read was the Gabler biography, the Neil Gabler one. And I found that the most helpful because the other biographies took probably a more historic approach, and that one took really kind of an armchair psychiatrist approach, where it was focused on getting into the head of Walt. And that I think allowed me to get into the character a little bit in writing it. So, hey, I'm pretty proud of this. Our production designer did the majority of major props in this film, but that one was all me. I actually bought a tiny little sewing machine to put that together.
We drive in and park in the main lot, just like the tourists.
Wait, I'm driving, right?
So this starts what was our big park shooting days.
Yeah, I do. Mom took me to the DMV after school today. I'm street legal.
And several of the techniques we talk about we kind of used. Our equipment cart was a stroller. So we packed that stroller full of equipment and dollied it around everywhere we wanted to go. And usually our lookout was also in charge of guarding the equipment, which means they were just standing there casually with the stroller playing on their phone, making sure security guards weren't taking too close of a glance at us.
Fine. Molly can drive. Carefully park the car.
Hey, motor mania is not a crime.
Molly.
I mean, it's fun to be free.
Now, Molly and I can get into the park for free, but I'm pretty sure that they'll be tracking my ID.
That sounds like my company.
So we shot for 3 days inside the park and 1 day kind of in the TTA parking lot area. And that comprises about 20 minutes of the movie, so we were filming a little bit faster than we were outside, even though we had the additional challenges of shooting in the park itself. All of these scenes had to be ADR'd. That's automatic dialogue replacement, which is a misnomer because there's nothing automatic about it, especially when the camera's not close and picking up the audio track itself. But we could explain cameras, we could explain a lot of things. Once we got into wireless mics, it was going to be very difficult to explain.
From there, we head to the dock.
No, Dad, the resort loops faster.
I want to ride the monorail through the Contemporary.
We're not riding the monorail. We're trying to blend in. Peter.
So the one scene we had that someone not tried to stop us, but caught on to what we were doing was right there, and we wound up dropping it because we couldn't get the reversals. But it was really funny because it was a girl who was trying to point out to her friends that a guy was talking to a bag, and none of her friends believed her, and they just kept pulling her on. But we didn't wind up using that. It was that same conversation he had on the boat, but it took place at the TTA instead, so we wound up using the boat version instead. So this was shot on the loading docks at the soundstage.
I've never seen a security guard take a second glance at a bag.
And I think it actually cuts in pretty well with the security guard footage. But that is true. If you're ever trying to sneak something into Walt Disney World, which of course I don't recommend, that has been my experience. So this was the shot we almost got stopped on, because the cast member recognized our actor. He is local to Orlando and does a lot of theater, and got recognized from one of the plays he was in, and they tried to have a long conversation, and then they noticed Amber, our cinematographer, who was shooting the whole time. Luckily, the guy was just believed that it was Daniel's girlfriend who was shooting it. I think he waves at the camera at some point that we didn't wind up using. But we added those cut-ins of Molly looking at the situation to kind of bridge some of the narrative gaps there. And I think it wound up cutting together really well.
What about you? And they have your prints too.
I think I'll just put on a Band-Aid. It probably won't check.
So here's that shot of him actually getting in. That one was actually shot 15 feet towards the water, which still cuts in remarkably well. So we filmed on Dapper Day weekend, which I just can't recommend highly enough because it just gave our extras such this sort of nostalgic 1960s feel. Which is, part of what the movie's about. This nostalgia for someone's childhood, or this nostalgia for a park, or, just generally. So the fact that we have these extras that look like they walked out of, film shot in 1960s, just was all the better. This song was it's originally called Meet Me Tonight at Dreamland, and it was written back in the turn of the century for a theme park near Coney Island. And I found the song, I rewrote the lyrics to it to make it about the situation, I suppose. I knew I wanted this musical number in it. A lot of Disney movies of the era, even if they don't have full music, even if they aren't a musical, have these musical numbers. I wanted something like that. So I handed this off to our composer. He came out with this fantastic arrangement for it. We got a terrific singer to record it. So yeah, I think it's really one of the high points of the film, and a lot of people have said that, so I think they're right. We shot a lot of Walt reaction footage, and ultimately what it came down to was it was not a movie about whether or not Walt liked a specific change. It had to be about Walt giving up control. And so we wound up using these shots like this where you see the outside of the bag, and you can't tell what he's thinking. There's another one coming up here. Yeah, right there. It's opaque, it's unknown, and it's implying, I think, this emotional response that's going on as he realizes what he's going to have to do to let go, instead of a direct... Oh, by the way, that's our producer right over his shoulder there. That's Tyler. We had 2 other producers besides myself on this film. Tyler Marino, who helped through the pre-production and early stages and filming in the parks, and then Mickey Garcia, who picked up for the bulk of regular production, and then all throughout post-production, and was just absolutely essential in getting this movie finished. And when we went to go shoot B-roll, she came and got to see the Magic Kingdom for the first time as an adult, which was a pretty cool experience for me to be shooting B-roll of Walt's head, getting a reaction to the Carousel of Progress, and also be sitting next to someone who's never seen the Carousel of Progress before. So that was a pretty cool experience. And to get the reaction of someone while we're working together to create this thing was a fun experience for a day of just shooting that, and then a lot of, just little park shots that we were going to use later in the movie.
Yeah, we'll go with that.
Peter, Haunted Mansion.
So Tyler and Amber Steele, who was the cinematographer, were absolutely essential in guiding me towards things that might be slightly harder to film at, but created much better images. I was all about playing it safe for a lot of the park shoots, but they were like, no, if we turn the camera around and shoot towards this direction, it'll be a much better, more interesting background. And that's ultimately, we wound up going with the harder direction 9 times out of 10. So we shot here. How were we so lucky to get those princesses walking there right when we shot?
Sorry, you were saying?
That was just, we were just far too lucky in life. So you can tell we obviously switched to our low light camera for these shots, because it is way too dark for our cinema cameras to be shooting, but they match pretty well with each other. And then we're going into the shots that we did on a soundstage. We rebuilt the ride vehicle as best we could, and Ron complains a lot that his face is obscured by that bar. I think it's a nice effect. I mean, ultimately there was nothing we could do about it. That's the way the bag is positioned, but I kind of like just seeing his eyes there. I don't have like a reason for it.
That's really bad.
But to me it works.
Really? I thought of it back in
So we finally kind of settled on the fact that there are lights like in Walt's bag. So it glows, and that was the way to kind of get around the fact that not all the lighting was going to be more consistent on his face, and it wasn't going to reflect the environment he was in.
Right?
What?
Sitting here with Walt Disney's head.
This scene was always in the movie, but originally it was a Peter Walt scene. Back before Molly came to the park with them. In the earlier versions of the script, Molly didn't come to the park.
A few years ago.
And it turned into a Molly Walt scene with some rewrites. And I was surprised after we came through the rewrites how much better it works as a Molly Walt scene. It gives her something to do. It gives her some more interesting character beats.
And then what do you do for 3 days?
I think it works pretty well as that.
Like a little bee, I fly from flower to flower.
So this little bee bit, that's actually what Walt told people he did. That's not something I made up for the movie. That was a common response when people asked what he did around the studio. But then this is sort of a twist on that, that he's almost identifying with the audio animatronics because his performance is so rote at this point.
You know what? I'm not a bee. I'm a ghost.
So we were able to use the imagery of the Haunted Mansion to kind of reinforce what Walt's feeling and what Walt's saying, and I think that all worked. Especially this little fade out here. That was nice. We shot so many times. That shot of the clock turning 13 was the one that I could not get better than that. Haunted Mansion is incredibly hard to film, and we sent the camera in so many times. We got a fast pass for every member of the crew, and they got to hold the camera that time on several of our shooting days. And then I redid it on several of our pickup days, and we just never got a better shot of that 13.
Honey, listen to yourself. She's actually becoming an adult.
But she's not one yet. Okay, I mean, she's...
Oh, I wanted to comment on the background music here, too. I think this works a little better than the SeaWorld background music. But part of the reason we had to ADR everything in the park, and I mean everything, was because there's consistent background music going throughout, and there was just no way to cut it together otherwise.
Let me know soon, because the permission slip is due in like a week.
Okay. I love you. I'm sorry. Force of habit.
I love you too, Peter.
Molly.
Here. You can count it if you
So
want.
we...
As a kid.
Part of the difficulty in filming this is that not only are you trying to not get noticed by security, but you also can't like ask people to move. So sometimes you just have to rearrange your plan based on the fact that there's a family of tourists sitting there, especially when there are phone chargers in that area. We did have to do a little rejiggering here, but you'll notice we got some shots across the flower beds. And we definitely got the shots that mattered in that. I still like the way that reveal turned out, that she's standing behind him. So that's a composite shot right there. The background wall was shot on a soundstage, and then the shots in the park were obviously shot in the park, and then that one shot was a VFX shot linking the two.
Feel like another citrus
So,
swirl?
from my perspective at this point, Walt has learned his lesson. And for Peter, he's not quite there yet. And that's, I think, the tension that's in this scene, where Walt can actually dispense real advice at this point because he's processing through and moving through the same process that Peter is, and they're recognizing the similarities in their situation.
You don't want your child to stop growing up, do you? Don't want her to stagnate?
And
So my daughter doesn't need me anymore.
we brought back this little girl as the vision of what Peter wants. And I think we're trying to show that that is this kind of idealized version. It's this one thing that you have for a moment and then is ultimately going to go away. As all things do, kids grow up, they move on, they need something different. This story to me is very personal because this is functionally my story. I didn't want kids. I said that as much, and I had a daughter, and suddenly my life was about something else, and it was a period of immense adjustment for me.
Nurse, she comes in sometime later and she wants to
But I can't explain it other than to say, like, you have a whole new perspective on life just from the knowledge that you have a child now.
Didn't want anyone else to have.
So, I recommend it.
What's that?
72 hours.
What? Walt?
So that bench is obviously not a Disney bench, which you can tell because it kind of shifts.
No, we've got to get you back to the lab, like right now.
Peter, it's
I
worth
was never
it.
quite happy
I
with
really
that,
like
but,
fireworks.
No.
David, the visual effects artist, actually did a fantastic job with this because there was actually nothing in that bag, so he had to put like 3 layers in, and then it moved several times, and that one's just pretty seamless. We had some plot discussions about how Molly finds them, and we had a more convoluted way of Molly finding them, and at the end of the day, it's like, she just runs into them. Like, sometimes that's just enough. Like, just run into them.
This looks like Molly doing something. Peter. The elevator's here somewhere, I swear.
What are we doing?
Hold up.
So this is once again back in that bowling alley.
Your time's run out, Walt. You gotta refreeze you or you're gonna die.
This is what I want.
What do you mean?
I think David, who wrote the score here, did a fantastic job at building the tension. in a way, because it's not an action sequence, right? Like, it's not even really running around. It's kind of like slight hurrying and dialogue, and I think the music really gives those visual cues with the emotions going on. So I'm very happy with how this came out.
We'll be fine. We're gonna take a cab.
That's not what I...
I don't have time to sit here and argue with you about whether or not we're
I don't mean that...
Damn it, Molly!
Just right there where the tension breaks, right after he swears at her, which I think we get the impression he hasn't ever done before. And then moving into this, Amber, we rode the monorail, or the people mover, so many times to get these. Just a surprising number of times to get these few shots, but it was all worth it. Not that you really need too much of an excuse to ride the people mover. But yeah, I think we rode 4 or 5 times, and several times the camera got passed back and forth between the cars. I'm really surprised we didn't get kicked out just for that.
Just drop me off at Epcot in the morning. Anyway,
So we tried to make this transition between the sepia-ish tone and the sepia that's intentionally black and, intentionally two-tone, because it has the text on it. We tried to make that as smooth as possible, so it is kind of a reveal and not immediately jarring. You can judge if that worked or not. So we were going to rent a cab for that, and for some reason we couldn't. I don't even remember why.
Hey, Dad, I think you...
So it was an Uber. He took an Uber.
Oh, Peter, it's all right.
Oh, we wound up introducing the idea that Walt can close his doors in post-production, partially because it helped sell the joke of him falling out of the thing and just hitting his head on it, which I thought was kind of funny, and partly because it really helped with this particular shot of Peter walking around the table. So that's why Walt can close his doors. He does have some level of volition over them, apparently. I wish we had a little LED light mounted in there so Walt kind of glowed onto the people around him. We talked about doing that in post, but it just wound up being too much effort for a that we have no 3D information.
You're right.
Oh, the mom sat out cookies. That was a nice little detail our production designer put in.
Walt Disney asked you for a personal favor. What were you going
Of course you would set out cookies if the CEO showed up at your door, right? Like, you'd have cookies.
What did you promise him?
Your job, I think.
Peter, we're looking for someone to run the Emporium down
I'll
on
do
Main Street. Well, that settles that. Now, Walt, you know the 72-hour time limit.
So this is the second of Walt's 2 monologues, and like the other one, well, I guess I should say it's the third, if we really look at it that way. It's also kind of takes as its jumping off point some real things that Walt said. I think he did have this tension in his later life between being this media celebrity and being a real person. So I really liked the idea that we extrapolated that out. I think I've talked before about there's a reason that this urban legend caught on, and it wasn't random. There's something about the character of Walt Disney and his desire to hold on to things and control them, but also be this congenial, happy uncle that makes it, I'm not saying believable, but there's it resonates on some sort of emotional level. And I think there is something that we look at the character of Walt and see this sort of desire for control. And that's hard to let go of, and that's something that the people who knew him and the people who write about him also echo, that he did have this level of control over his life and his employees and his medium and his art that was, that was really a part of his personality.
Things. Hell, I've lasted this long.
Please. Excuse me.
Something wrong?
Yes. But I think I can fix it.
Just a minute, Peter. We were talking to Denise. She said you were looking for one of these.
So here's where we set up, I think, the last sort of dramatic reveal of the movie. Obviously, it's that doll he's wanted the whole movie. And, you know, you think that the present that he hands over is going to be that doll, but it turns out, no, it's something else. So, you know, hopefully that shows that's a physical representation of the change that he's gone under.
Oh, Mr. Disney?
Oh, I should note that this scene coming up here, I went to the Orlando amateur train enthusiast meeting, and I went around and said, like, okay, who's got the best home display in the city? And they all gave me the same name, and finally I got the guy's contact information. I cannot remember his name off the top of my head. He's in the credits. You can look him up if you want to. But everyone said, like, oh, no, he has the best one. You gotta get in contact with this guy. And he had the most elaborate train set I've ever seen, much less in a person's garage. It's probably 3 times larger than what we're showing here. We tried to capture the scope of it and just failed. So, you know, so many of these little shots worked just because he had this beautiful thing set up, and this required no production design on our part. This is all just his garage and the trains within. And then you see that little sound effect of the little train comes back in, because it's, you know, with the imagery there that time. So once again, that was a nice little, a nice way of calling back in sort of an auditory way.
I don't know what you did, but she's pissed.
There's Missouri Crickets again.
Would you give her this, please?
So just a note on the costume design, we always had Peter in these kind of 1960s shirts, and that was really intentional to reinforce the 1960s aesthetic, to the extent that it was. It's not set in the 60s, it's not even, yeah, it's set in the present day, but whatever we could to kind of hint at this older aesthetic. And that was the shots, that was in some ways the music, to reinforce that kind of, this is the type of movie it is, this is the type of storyline. And obviously here's the reveal that I was talking about earlier, where we set it up for being the Mickey doll. Daniel has a filthy mouth on him and kept trying to make the actors and crew members crack up during this shot, which we told him was just going to be silent. And he took that as license to tell dirty jokes.
Hey, Walt.
Someone's up early.
Yeah. I think I might be moving back in with Caroline. It's in the guest bedroom, but that's progress, right?
Baby steps.
Yeah. Yeah.
So originally we had that TV playing something again, and the audio just got really distracting in the scene. So now Walt's kind of like looking at nothing when Peter walks in, but yeah, he's just staring off into space, I suppose.
Really? Not Epcot?
It's not going anywhere.
So I chose Stone Mountain just because of its proximity to Orlando, and it's kind of this tourist attraction. People were asking why. I really didn't have anything else in mind. I probably would have chosen something else had I known how many people were going to ask about it.
Unless your highest ambition.
So we originally ended the film with this shot of Peter, and we added this shot at the end, and we really had to find a shot of Walt smiling because we didn't plan on that being the last shot. But we changed it, and we did. Oh, these title cards are drawn by Rob Yo, very talented artist. You should look him up. I should tell the story now that I have the chance about us getting Ron on board for this movie. I met Ron at a screening of a documentary called The Dark Side of Disney, which he was selling his book at, and I picked up a copy of his book and met him, and it was fantastic for me because I loved the Imagination Pavilion when I was a kid. He inspired me in incredible ways, and so I got to meet Ron, dream come true. And I showed the teaser of the movie beforehand, and so I just kind of tucked away, like, maybe Ron could play Walt, and tucked that away. And finally, months later, I kind of brought this up to Mickey, and she was like, well, we can ask him, like, see if he's interested and see if he'd be willing to do an audition. Like, we weren't sure at that point. Like, it'd been a long time. I couldn't remember his acting talents. He sends in his video audition, nails the role. According to him, he spent the entire night just reading the script, and was absolutely a joy to work with. His part was filmed with a couple days on a soundstage. But he's just been such a wonderful part of the movie since then, that it's been like we've had him on the whole time. And I can't imagine the movie with anyone else. Oh, there's that trash can I told you we stole. We gave it back, don't worry. So people keep asking me who this is. I thought it was obvious that it was Steve Jobs. Apparently it's not obvious because people keep asking. If you pause that earlier on the computer monitor, you can see that there's a few references there that should indicate that it is indeed Steve Jobs. Well, thank you guys so much for listening to this commentary track. I hope you enjoyed it. If you guys ever have any additional questions about the film, I'm on Twitter at Walt's Frozen Head, no O in Frozen. So reach out to me there, and I'll probably quote tweet you and answer the question. Thank you guys so much for watching again. Oh, I want to thank all of our Kickstarters. You'll see all their names in just a minute. Look through them. Some of them had very clever titles that they got to pick for themselves. We really couldn't have done it without them, so I have to thank each and every one of them individually, but instead of reading their names, I'll just put them up there on the screen for you guys. So once again, thanks for listening. Thanks for buying the DVD. And I will talk to you guys later.